My daughter gave me an ultimatum: either serve her husband like a hired hand or pack my belongings and leave the property entirely. I simply smiled, grabbed my suitcase, and quietly walked out the door. 1 week later, the screen of my phone lit up with 45 missed calls from them. They had just discovered the devastating truth about the ground they were standing on. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. The sharp, piercing blare of a car horn shattered the morning quiet of my property. I stepped out of my small wooden guest house just in time to see Bradley, my son-in-law, aggressively revving the engine of his luxury SUV. The exhaust clouded the crisp Seattle air. He stepped out of the vehicle and walked straight toward me with heavy, arrogant strides. He did not offer a good morning. He did not offer a simple greeting. He did not offer any human decency at all. Instead, he threw his heavy set of car keys directly at my chest. The metal struck my collarbone hard and clattered onto the cold brick patio. He crossed his arms and demanded that I wash the car inside and out. He demanded that I change the oil before 12 noon. He claimed he had an important business meeting and needed the vehicle looking absolutely immaculate. He turned his back and walked toward the main house without waiting for a single word of response from me. I stood there in the chilly morning air. I looked down at the keys resting on the red bricks. My silence was not submission. My silence was the heavy, suffocating endurance of a father trying desperately to keep the peace in a house that no longer felt like his own. The heavy oak door of the main house swung open and my daughter, Victoria Vance, stepped out onto the patio. I looked into her eyes, searching for a trace of the little girl I had raised, hoping she would defend her father against this blatant disrespect. She did not defend me. She did not even look at the keys lying on the ground. She immediately began to complain about the rising utility bills. She crossed her arms and reminded me that I was living completely rent-free in the guest house. She stated that performing a few chores for her husband was the absolute least I could do to compensate them for my living expenses. Her words twisted like a rusty knife in my gut. I had voluntarily surrendered the master suite and the entire main house to them when they got married. As a retired structural engineer, I had designed and built this lakefront estate from the ground up alongside my late wife, Margaret. I handed over my life's work to give my daughter the perfect start to her new marriage. That ultimate sacrifice had now been mutated into a binding, suffocating obligation. I was no longer the patriarch of this family. I was a tenant, paying my dues in sweat and daily humiliation. I picked up the keys from the damp bricks. I gathered the heavy plastic bucket, the soap, and the sponges from the garage. I opened the heavy doors of the SUV and began to clean. I wiped away the dirt. I wiped away the dried mud. I wiped away the suffocating disdain. I wiped away the bitter, stinging tears that threatened to fall from my eyes. I worked in total silence, scrubbing the leather seats, performing the manual labor demanded by a man who had never lifted a single finger to build anything in his entire life. As I reached deep under the back passenger seat to vacuum the carpet, my knuckles brushed against a thick stack of papers tucked away in the darkness. I pulled them out into the light. They were receipts. Dozens of pristine, high-end retail receipts, all bearing Bradley's name. They detailed thousands of dollars spent on designer watches, custom-tailored suits, and exclusive golf club memberships. The complaints Victoria Vance had made just an hour earlier about their crushing debt and the overwhelming utility bills instantly unraveled into a ridiculous, pathetic lie. My son-in-law was not drowning in hardship. He was swimming in luxury funding, his sheer arrogance while forcing me to act as his unpaid servant. A dark, quiet suspicion ignited in the very center of my chest. Dinner that evening was consumed by a thick, oppressive tension. We sat around the large mahogany dining table that I had built with my own hands 30 years ago. Bradley chewed his food with exaggerated disgust. He slammed his heavy silver fork down onto the porcelain plate. The sharp clatter echoed violently through the dining room. He declared that the steak I had cooked was unforgivably dry. He pushed his plate away in dramatic protest. Then he leaned forward, resting his elbows on the polished wood, and issued a new mandate. He stated that starting next month, I would be entirely responsible for scrubbing and chemically treating the massive swimming pool in the backyard. He claimed he refused to waste another dime on external pool maintenance services when there was perfectly capable help living mere yards away. I slowly turned my head and looked directly at Victoria Vance. I stared at my daughter, waiting for her to intervene, waiting for her to draw a line and defend my dignity. Victoria Vance turned her face away. She stared blankly at the wall, actively dodging the heavy gaze of her father. She chose her husband's cruelty over my dignity. I placed my cloth napkin perfectly flat on the table. I stood up. The heavy wooden legs of my chair scraped loudly, violently against the hardwood floor. That harsh, grinding noise was the only sound left in the room. As I turned my back and walked out into the night, knowing exactly what I had to do next, the heavy, rhythmic thud of bass from the main patio vibrated through the floorboards of my wooden guest house. It was barely 10 in the morning on a Saturday. For 30 years, Saturday mornings on this Seattle lakefront meant the quiet lapping of water against the dock and the smell of pine carried by the crisp wind. I had built this sanctuary with my own hands. I laid the foundation, framed the walls, and engineered a home meant to harbor generations of peace. Now the air was choked with the smell of cheap cigars, expensive cologne, and the shrill laughter of strangers. Bradley had invited his entire network of superficial business partners for a lavish poolside barbecue. I sat in my small kitchens, nursing a cup of black coffee, watching the chaotic display through the glass door. They lounged around the custom infinity pool I had designed for Margaret. They spilled their drinks on the imported stone. They acted like masters of an empire they had not built. I watched Bradley moving among them. He wore a designer linen shirt unbuttoned to his chest, holding a crystal glass, pointing to the sprawling main house as if he had laid every brick himself. He was performing. He was selling an illusion of immense wealth and untouchable success to a crowd of men who looked equally desperate to prove their own worth. I took another slow sip of my coffee. I felt the familiar heavy ache in my chest, a quiet grief for what my family had become. I had stepped aside to give Victoria Vance the master suite. I had retreated to this small cabin to give my daughter the space to build her own marriage. I traded my comfort for her supposed happiness. That sacrifice was now an open invitation for relentless humiliation. The handle of my front door twisted violently. There was no knock. There was no polite request for entry. The heavy wooden door swung open with a harsh crack against the wall. Bradley stood in the doorway, blocking out the morning sun. The noise from the patio flooded into my quiet space. He did not wipe his feet. He stepped onto the clean hardwood floor, tracking wet footprints from the pool. He looked around my modest living quarters with a sneer that twisted his entire face. His eyes landed on my worn leather work boots resting neatly by the entryway. Those boots had walked every inch of this property during its construction. They were a testament to decades of honest, backbreaking labor. Bradley did not see a lifetime of hard work. He saw an obstacle. He swung his foot and kicked my boots violently across the room. One struck the wall and fell sideways. I placed my coffee mug on the kitchen island. I did not raise my voice. I did not demand an apology. I simply looked at the man who had hijacked my daughter's mind. He marched toward me with a bundle of white fabric crumpled in his fist. He tossed it onto the counter right in front of me. It was a catering apron. The fabric was stark white, stiff and completely degrading. I looked at the apron and then up at his flushed, arrogant face. He leaned against my counter and issued his command. He told me the catering staff he hired was running behind schedule, and his guests were getting hungry. He pointed a finger at my chest and instructed me to put on the apron. He ordered me to walk over to the outdoor kitchen, retrieve the massive silver platters of grilled seafood, and begin serving his business partners immediately. He did not ask if I was busy. He did not ask for a favor from his father-in-law. He issued a directive to a subordinate. He leaned closer, his breath reeking of expensive bourbon and unchecked audacity. He told me that his investors needed to see a well-oiled machine. He wanted them to see a man of profound influence. He explicitly stated that having the former owner of the estate walking around serving crab legs and oysters would be a fantastic power play. He wanted to parade me in front of his associates as a conquered patriarch. He wanted to show them that he was so successful, so utterly dominant that he had reduced his wife's father to a mere domestic servant. I stared at him in profound silence. My mind processed the sheer magnitude of his disrespect. This was not a lazy son-in-law asking for help with a chore. This was a calculated execution of my dignity. He wanted to strip me of my status on my own land. He needed to diminish me to elevate his fragile ego. I looked past his shoulder through the open door. I saw the crowd of men laughing loudly. I saw Victoria Vance standing among them sipping champagne, completely absorbed in the hollow spectacle her husband had orchestrated. She knew he had come to my cabin. She knew exactly what he was demanding of me. She had chosen to look the other way. The silence in my small kitchen stretched out thick and dangerous. Bradley tapped his knuckles against the granite counter, growing impatient with my lack of movement. He told me to hurry up because powerful men do not wait for their food. He warned me not to embarrass him by looking miserable while I served. He demanded a smile. He demanded complete subservience. He was absolutely convinced that his authority was absolute. He believed my silence was submission. He believed my age was a weakness. He believed that because I had given them the main house, I had surrendered my spine. He turned his back to me and began walking toward the door, fully expecting me to tie the white apron around my waist and follow him out like a trained dog. He adjusted his expensive collar, ready to return to his stage and play the role of the magnificent host. He left the apron resting on my counter, a white flag of surrender. He demanded I wave in front of his entire world. The heavy bass of the music outside continued to pulse through the floor. The laughter of strangers echoed off the walls I had built. The conflict had reached its absolute peak, vibrating with a tension that demanded an immediate and irreversible response. I stood perfectly still as his footsteps echoed toward the door. I looked at the white fabric on the counter. Every fiber of that apron represented the death of a boundary I should have drawn years ago. I remembered the days I spent carrying lumber up this very hill, the sweat burning my eyes driven by the sole purpose of providing a fortress for my family. I had engineered this estate to withstand earthquakes and severe storms. Yet, I had allowed a much more insidious force to erode its foundation from the inside out. I had let a parasite claim the throne. Bradley paused at the threshold and looked over his shoulder. He snapped his fingers at me, a sharp, piercing sound that cut through the heavy air. He commanded me to move faster. He said his patience was running thin and he would not tolerate a lazy tenant ruining his important afternoon. He used the word tenant. He spoke the word with a deliberate, venomous emphasis. He truly believed he owned the ground beneath my feet. He truly believed he owned me. The air in the room felt suddenly cold. The lingering scent of his bourbon mixed with the fresh lake breeze coming through the open door. The contrast between my quiet, disciplined life and his chaotic, arrogant existence had never been more stark. I did not feel a sudden burst of uncontrollable rage. I felt a terrifying crystalline clarity. The illusion of family loyalty evaporated completely. The desperate hope that my daughter would eventually realize her mistake vanished into the Seattle wind. The man standing in my doorway was not a relative. He was an invader who had crossed the final line. The time for silent endurance had officially expired. I held the stiff white fabric of the catering apron in my hands. It felt rough against my calloused fingers, fingers that had poured the concrete for the foundation beneath us. Fingers that had framed the walls, sheltering the man currently demanding my servitude. I did not tie the strings around my waist. I did not bow my head. I did not accept the role he assigned me. I looked down at the apron, balled it into a tight fist, and dropped it straight into the stainless steel trash can. The sound of the lid snapping shut echoed through the quiet of my kitchen. It was a sharp, metallic sound. It was the sound of a boundary being drawn in stone. I looked Bradley directly in the eyes. I told him I would not be serving his guests. I told him I was a father, an engineer, and a man who had built this estate from the dirt up. I told him I was not his hired help. My refusal was not a negotiation. My refusal was a solid, unbreakable wall. The air in the room instantly turned toxic. Bradley stared at the trash can. He stared at the discarded apron. Then he stared at me. His face contorted. The smug, confident mask of a successful businessman shattered completely. The polished exterior vanished, revealing the volatile, entitled boy underneath. He did not argue. He did not attempt to persuade me. He lunged forward. His hand gripped my upper arm. His fingers dug into my flesh with aggressive, unhinged force. I am 67 years old. I am strong, but the sheer suddenness of his physical assault caught me off guard. He yanked me forward. He dragged me across the hardwood floor of my own guest house. He pulled me violently toward the floor-to-ceiling glass doors that looked out onto the patio. The heavy bass of his music outside thumped against the glass. The patio was crowded with his business associates, men in expensive linen shirts, women holding crystal champagne flutes. They were laughing, they were drinking, and now they were turning their heads to look at the spectacle unfolding behind the glass. Bradley shoved me close to the pane. He wanted them to see. He needed them to witness his absolute dominance. He pointed a trembling finger at my face and unleashed a torrent of humiliation. His voice was loud, echoing off the wooden beams of the ceiling. He called me a freeloader. He called me a pathetic old man, refusing to accept his irrelevance. He leaned in close, his breath hot against my cheek, and delivered his final venomous blow. He called me a parasite. A parasite. He used that exact word. A parasite living off the wealth of the younger generation, a parasite draining his resources, a parasite clinging to a lifestyle I could no longer afford, a parasite sucking the lifeblood out of his perfect marriage. He shouted the words so loudly that the glass seemed to vibrate with his anger. I stood there inches from the transparent barrier, separating my private degradation from public consumption. I saw the guests outside whispering. I saw them pointing. I saw the pity and the judgment in their eyes. They believed his narrative. They saw a successful young executive burdened by an ungrateful dependent father-in-law. They saw exactly what Bradley wanted them to see. He continued his verbal assault. He told me I was nothing without him and Victoria Vance. He told me my entire existence on this property was an act of extreme charity on his part. He demanded gratitude. He demanded absolute obedience in exchange for the oxygen I consumed on his estate. He wanted me to beg. He wanted me to apologize. He wanted me to retrieve the apron from the trash and walk out onto that patio with my head bowed. I did not raise my hands to fight him off. I did not raise my voice to match his screaming. I stood perfectly still. I let his words wash over me. I let the humiliation sink into my bones. Every insult, every degrading label, every threat, I absorbed them all because with every word he shouted, he was confirming exactly who he was. He was not a protector. He was not family. He was a predator who confused kindness with weakness. He confused my silence with submission. He confused my patience with cowardice. The illusion was completely gone. The hope that I could quietly endure my final years in the background of their lives evaporated. He had made his position absolutely clear. He believed he held all the power. He believed he held all the cards. He believed I was a helpless old man with nowhere else to go. I looked away from the guests outside. I looked away from the sparkling blue water of the pool I had built. I turned my head and locked eyes with the man still gripping my arm. I did not give him the satisfaction of seeing anger. I did not give him the satisfaction of seeing fear. I gave him nothing but cold, absolute clarity. The physical assault, the public humiliation, the blatant lies. Each action was a link in a chain that was rapidly pulling us toward an inevitable destruction. He thought he was breaking me down. He had no idea he was simply stripping away the last ounce of mercy I had left for him. He wanted a war over authority. He was about to get one. But it would not be fought with shouting matches or physical altercations. It would be fought with cold, hard facts, and I held every single fact in my hand. The heavy glass door slid open with a violent scrape against its metal track. Victoria Vance marched into the guest house. The loud chatter and the thumping bass from the patio spilled in behind her before she shoved the door completely shut, sealing us in a suffocating bubble of tension. I looked at my daughter. For a fraction of a second, the deepest instinct of a father flared inside my chest. I expected her to look at Bradley's flushed, angry face and tell him to back down. I expected her to see the stiff white catering apron crumpled in the trash can and realize how far her husband had crossed the line of basic human decency. I expected a daughter to defend her father. I received a stranger. Victoria Vance did not look at me with an ounce of concern. She did not ask what had happened. She did not ask why I was standing backed against my own kitchen counter. She walked directly to Bradley and stood shoulder to shoulder with him. She crossed her arms tightly over her expensive silk blouse. She lifted her chin, looking down her nose at the man who had carried her on his shoulders, the man who had taught her how to walk. The physical alignment in the room was devastatingly clear. The battle lines were permanently drawn. She had chosen her side, and I was officially the enemy. Mong Bradley let out a harsh, theatrical breath. He pointed a finger at me and told Victoria Vance that I was deliberately ruining his networking event. He complained that I was being completely uncooperative and trying to embarrass him in front of his crucial investors. Victoria Vance nodded slowly, validating his ridiculous narrative. She turned her cold, calculating gaze onto me. She did not see a retired engineer. She did not see a grieving widower. She saw a stubborn employee refusing to do his job. She asked me why I was making things so incredibly difficult for everyone. She stated that Bradley worked tirelessly to provide a prestigious image for their family, and my stubborn defiance was humiliating them both. I looked at the daughter I had sacrificed everything for. I kept my voice perfectly level. I told her that washing cars and serving appetizers to arrogant strangers was not part of the agreement. When I handed over the keys to my estate, I reminded her that I built this property so our family could have peace, not so I could become an unpaid servant to her husband. Her face hardened into stone. The slight warm resemblance she bore to her mother vanished instantly, replaced by a mask of pure unadulterated entitlement. She took a step forward, invading my personal space with calculated aggression. She was no longer asking for a favor, she was delivering a decree. She told me this was their home now. She claimed they carried the massive social and financial weight of maintaining the property, a blatant lie, considering I was still secretly covering the property taxes and major insurances. She looked me dead in the eye and laid out the absolute terms of my continued existence on this land. She gave me exactly two choices. I could retrieve that catering apron from the trash, walk out to the sunny patio, and serve her husband's guests with a grateful smile on my face. Or I could pack my belongings into a suitcase, surrender my keys, and walk off the property before the sun went down. I stood in absolute shock. The sheer audacity of her demand paralyzed my vocal cords. I had literally given her the roof over her head, and she was threatening to throw me onto the street because I refused to carry a tray of seafood. But Victoria Vance was not finished. She recognized my silence and decided it was the perfect moment to deliver a fatal, unforgivable blow. She reached into the most sacred, protected part of my heart and pulled out the memory of her mother. She lowered her voice to a venomous, hissing whisper. She told me Margaret would be utterly disgusted with my behavior today. She stated that my late wife, the woman who had helped me lay every single brick of this estate, would be deeply ashamed to see how pathetic and selfish her husband had become in his old age. Victoria Vance claimed her mother would despise the fact that I was clinging to them like a desperate parasite. She accused me of ruining their happiness and sabotaging their success simply because I was too proud to be helpful to the family. The mention of Margaret was a physical strike. It felt like a jagged knife twisted directly into my ribs by my own flesh and blood. Margaret had passed away 5 years ago. We had designed this lakefront sanctuary as a monument to our enduring love. We had spent countless nights planning where our future grandchildren would play on the expansive green lawn. Victoria Vance was now weaponizing that beautiful, pure dream to justify her extreme cruelty. She was using the ghost of my wife, her own mother, to force me into submission. The air vanished from my lungs. The kitchen seemed to shrink, the walls closing in around me. I looked at the two people standing in front of me. Bradley wore a smug, victorious smirk, proud of the attack dog he had unleashed upon me. Victoria Vance stood tall, perfectly convinced of her own righteous anger, entirely blind to the monster she had become. They expected me to break. They expected the invocation of Margaret's name to shatter my resolve, to bring me to my knees in a puddle of guilt and tears. They waited for my shoulders to slump. They waited for me to reach into the trash can, pull out the apron, and surrender my dignity to save my place in my daughter's life. But they miscalculated. They fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the man standing before them. The pain of hearing Margaret's name used as a weapon did not break me down. It burned away the very last illusion I held about my daughter. The girl I had raised was dead, replaced by a hollow shell, entirely consumed by greed and superficiality. There was nothing left to salvage. There was no relationship left to protect. The umbilical cord of my unconditional love dried up and snapped in that exact second. I did not scream. I did not hurl insults back at her. I did not try to defend Margaret's memory to a woman who had clearly forgotten everything her mother stood for. The time for fatherly guidance was over. The time for brutal, silent adjustment had arrived. I looked at Victoria Vance, truly seeing the stranger she was, and prepared to give her exactly what she asked for, but in a way she would never anticipate. The air in the room stopped moving. The heavy bass from the patio outside became a muffled, distant thud. Victoria Vance stood with her arms crossed, breathing heavily, waiting for the impact of her words to break me. She waited for the tears. She waited for the desperate pleas of an old man, terrified of abandonment. She waited for me to drop to my knees and beg for my place in her life. She waited for me to surrender my pride, to preserve the fragile illusion of our family. I did not give her tears. I did not give her pleas. I did not give her a single word of defense for Margaret. I gave her a smile. It was not a smile of warmth. It was a smile of absolute chilling finality. I looked at the daughter I had raised, the woman who had just used her dead mother's memory as a cheap weapon, and I smiled. It was the smile of an engineer who has just inspected a crumbling foundation and realized the building cannot be saved. The demolition is not a tragedy. The demolition is a necessity. I watched the triumph drain out of Victoria Vance's face. The harsh, arrogant lines around her mouth softened into sudden creeping confusion. She took a step backward. Her expensive heel caught slightly on the edge of the rug. She bumped into Bradley's shoulder. Bradley's smug smirk faltered. They had prepared for a war of words. They had prepared to conquer a weeping, begging father. They had not prepared for absolute silence. My silence was a mirror reflecting their ugliness right back at them. I did not need to shout. I did not need to argue. The debate was over. The contract was terminated. I turned my back on them. I walked slowly and deliberately to the small closet in the corner of the room. I did not rush. I did not pack frantically. I simply reached down and grabbed the handle of the small black leather suitcase. It was already packed. It had been packed since the morning I found the credit card receipts under the seat of Bradley's car. An engineer does not wait for the roof to cave in before he finds the exit. An engineer prepares for the structural failure long before the final crack echoes through the walls. I gripped the handle of the suitcase. I pulled it out into the center of the room. The wheels rolled smoothly over the hardwood planks. The sound was sharp. The sound was steady. The sound was the physical manifestation of my departure. I turned and faced them one last time. I gripped the handle of my luggage. I walked directly toward the open doorway. Bradley stood in my path, his chest puffed out, trying to reclaim the physical dominance he felt slipping away. I did not ask him to move. I did not acknowledge his presence as a threat. And GT-ject. I kept walking at a steady, rhythmic pace. I walked directly at him with the cold momentum of a freight train. At the very last possible second, his nerve broke. He stepped aside. He pressed his back against the doorframe to let me pass. He yielded the ground. I stepped over the threshold. The humid air of the lake hit my face. The noise of the party washed over me, but it meant nothing now. It was just background noise to a life I no longer inhabited. I walked across the brick patio. I walked past the custom outdoor kitchen. I walked past the infinity pool I had designed for Margaret. I looked at the water. I looked at the stone. I felt absolutely nothing. The emotional attachment of the property had been severed the moment Victoria Vance spoke her mother's name in vain. This was no longer my sanctuary. This was a crime scene of emotional extortion. I walked down the long winding driveway. The wheels of my suitcase hummed against the asphalt. A steady rhythmic hum, a hum of freedom, a hum of severing ties. I did not look over my shoulder. I did not turn back to see if Victoria Vance was watching from the window. I did not look back to see if she was crying. Her tears were no longer my burden to bear. Her financial disasters were no longer my problems to solve. Her toxic marriage was no longer my cross to carry. I reached the heavy iron gates at the end of the estate. I pressed the remote button on my keychain. The gates swung open. I stepped out onto the main road. Back in the guest house, the atmosphere remained completely frozen. My sudden silent departure had sucked the oxygen out of the room. Victoria Vance stood perfectly still. The victory she thought she had won tasted like ash in her mouth. She had issued an ultimatum. She had expected to establish total control. Instead, she had triggered a complete abandonment. She looked at the empty space where I had stood. She looked at the trash can where the white apron remained crumpled and discarded. A cold, dark seed of anxiety planted itself deep in her chest. It took root immediately. She realized with a sudden suffocating panic that a man who walks away from his entire life's work without shedding a single tear is not a defeated man. A man who smiles when he is thrown out of his own home is a man who knows a secret. The physical conflict was over. The shouting had ceased. The threats were hanging uselessly in the air. But the true war had just begun. Victoria Vance had won the battle for the guest house. She had successfully defended her husband's fragile ego. But as she stared at the open doorway, she felt the horrifying weight of an impending disaster. She realized she had just kicked out the only safety net she had ever known. The silence I left behind was louder than any scream. The physical space was hers, but the psychological warfare had officially commenced, and I was already moving toward my first devastating strike. The elevator ascended smoothly to the 42nd floor of the downtown Seattle high-rise. The quiet hum of the machinery was a stark contrast to the chaotic thumping bass I had left behind at the lakefront estate. I stepped out into a corridor of polished marble and frosted glass. I walked directly into the office of Robert Hayes. Robert was a man carved from logic and legal precedent. He was not a therapist. He was not a family counselor. He was a master architect of legal dismantling. I sat in the heavy leather chair opposite his desk. The room smelled of expensive coffee and old paper. I placed my worn leather-bound folder flat on the center of the pristine glass table. The physical slap of the leather hitting the glass broke the absolute silence of the room. It was the sound of my patience permanently expiring. Robert looked at the folder. He looked at my face. He had represented me for 2 decades. He had handled Margaret's estate when she passed away. He knew the agonizing depths of the sacrifices I had made to ensure Victoria Vance had a flawless foundation for her adult life. He saw the cold, hollow emptiness in my eyes and understood instantly that the era of quiet endurance was over. I did not offer any small talk. I did not complain about the disrespect or the shouting by the pool. I simply told him the arrangement was terminated. I told him the protective walls I had built around my daughter were coming down today. Robert reached across the glass table and pulled the folder toward him. He opened the cover. The document resting on top was not a standard property deed. It was the master agreement of a revocable living trust. It was the ultimate unyielding truth of the ground my daughter and her arrogant husband were currently standing on. For 3 entire years, Bradley had paraded around the lakefront property, acting as the supreme sovereign ruler. For 3 years, Victoria Vance had played the role of the wealthy A's, managing her grand inherited domain. For 3 years, they had hosted lavish parties, authorized expensive landscaping modifications, and treated me like a parasitic squatter, encroaching on their magnificent kingdom. They had built an entire empire of arrogance on a foundation of absolute pathetic ignorance. The estate did not belong to Bradley. The estate did not belong to Victoria Vance. The estate had never belonged to them in any legal, physical, or theoretical capacity. Every single brick of the main house, every drop of water in the custom infinity pool, every blade of grass on the manicured lawn, and the heavy wooden beams of the guest cabin were legally bound to the trust, and I was the sole living trustee. I retained absolute, undeniable, and irrevocable control over every single asset. I had never signed over the deed. I had never transferred the title. I had simply allowed them to occupy the space to help them save money while they established their careers. They were not homeowners. They were not landlords. They were temporary guests. They were guests who had vastly overstayed their welcome. They were guests who had violently bitten the hand that provided the very roof, sheltering them from the rain. Robert adjusted his glasses. He traced his silver pen over the original signatures Margaret and I had placed on the heavy parchment over a decade ago. He looked up and confirmed the stark reality of their situation. He stated that Bradley and Victoria Vance possessed zero equity in the property. They possessed zero legal standing to dictate who resided on the land. They possessed absolutely no leverage whatsoever. Under the strict housing laws of Washington state, they were legally classified as tenants at sufferance. The profound irony settled over the quiet office. The very people who had ordered me to pack my bags and vacate the premises held absolutely zero authority to issue such a command. Their entire existence of luxury, their entire social standing among their shallow friends, was a phantom structure. It was an illusion entirely propped up by my quiet, invisible generosity, a generosity they had fatally mistaken for weakness, a generosity I was now actively and ruthlessly rescinding. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the cool glass. I instructed Robert to initiate the necessary legal protocols. I wanted the invisible shield of my protection dropped immediately. I wanted the crushing reality of their situation brought into the harsh, unforgiving light of day. I sat back in the heavy chair and felt the steady, methodical rhythm of justice begin to turn its gears. The violent humiliation on the patio had been the catalyst. This sterile, quiet room was the execution chamber for their unearned privilege. I watched Robert pull out a fresh legal pad. His pen hovered over the blank paper. The physical conflict was over, but the structural demolition of their false reality had officially commenced. I instructed Robert to look deeper into the public records. I told him to pull any financial documents, credit histories, or municipal records tied to the estate address. I knew Bradley was a man obsessed with appearances. If he had been acting as the supreme owner of the estate in his social life, I needed to know exactly how he was representing himself on paper. A man who lies about his wealth to his friends will inevitably lie to the banks. A man who treats his father-in-law like a servant will not hesitate to exploit the system. I needed to see the full extent of the rot hiding beneath the floorboards. The vault of secrets was officially open. The systematic dismantling of their fraudulent empire was ready to begin. The air in the room stopped moving entirely. The quiet hum of the high-rise office was replaced by the deafening roar of a truth I had never wanted to confront. Robert turned his attention away from the physical documents and toward the glowing screens of his dual monitors. The room was absolutely silent except for the rapid clicking of his keyboard. I sat perfectly still in the heavy leather chair. I watched the reflection of the computer screens dance across the polished glass of the table between us. I had asked Robert to pull the public records and financial histories tied to my estate. I expected to find neglected property taxes or perhaps a secondary mortgage they had foolishly attempted to secure against a house they did not own. I was prepared for financial negligence. I was entirely unprepared for a calculated and systematic financial slaughter. Robert stopped typing. He pushed his glasses slightly up the bridge of his nose. He did not speak immediately. He leaned closer to the monitor as if the digital numbers presented a puzzle he could not quite believe. He clicked his mouse twice. A new window opened and filled the entire screen with dense black text and long columns of numbers. He slowly turned the monitor so it faced me directly. He asked me to look at the screen and verify the accounts listed under my primary social security number. I leaned forward. I narrowed my eyes to read the glowing text. I saw my name printed clearly at the top of the report. Richard Vance. Beneath my name was a long cascading list of active credit accounts. There were 7 premium credit cards listed. They were platinum accounts and high-yield travel cards associated with elite financial institutions. I stared at the list in profound confusion. I possessed exactly 1 credit card. It was a standard low-limit card I kept for emergency medical expenses and gasoline. I had always paid for my construction materials in cash. I had always believed that a man should never spend money he did not physically hold in his hands. That rigid financial discipline was the exact reason I had been able to build the lakefront estate in the first place. I told Robert that the report was fundamentally flawed. I told him I did not own any of those premium accounts. Robert did not argue. He simply clicked on the first account on the list. To expand the details, the screen refreshed. The primary account holder was listed as Richard Vance. The secondary authorized user with full spending privileges was listed as Bradley Miller. I felt the air leave my lungs. I told Robert to open the next account. The result was identical. I told him to open the third. The exact same names appeared. Bradley had not simply lived rent-free in my home. He had stolen my pristine and meticulously maintained credit history to forge an entire empire of fraudulent wealth. Robert pulled up the transaction histories for the past 36 months. The filthy truth of my son-in-law spilled across the screen in brutal detail. The numbers told a story of grotesque and unchecked gluttony. I saw a charge for $7. Zero Zana at a boutique furniture store in downtown Seattle. I saw recurring charges of $3,000 a month at an elite country club. Though I saw the receipts for the imported stone Bradley had laid around the infinity pool. I saw the charges for the designer linen shirts he wore unbuttoned to his chest. I saw the massive invoice from the catering company he had hired for his lavish barbecue just hours ago. I was looking at the exact cost of my own humiliation. Bradley had not paid for a single ounce of his luxurious lifestyle. He had used my name and my reputation and my invisible wealth to buy the expensive bourbon he had breathed into my face. He had used my money to purchase the white catering apron he threw into my trash can. He had financed his entire performance of dominance using the very lifeblood of the man he called a pathetic parasite. He was a tick burrowed deep into my financial veins, growing fat and arrogant on the resources I had bled to secure. My hand moved entirely on its own. My fingers closed around a heavy silver pen resting on Robert's desk. I lifted the pen. I brought the metal tip down against the thick glass table. Tap! A sharp, clear sound pierced the silence of the office. The sound vibrated in my chest. Tap! I brought the pen down again. The rhythm was slow. The rhythm was deliberate. The rhythm was the physical manifestation of a betrayal so deep it defied language. Tap! Every strike of the pen against the glass echoed the pain of a father who had sacrificed everything. I remembered working late into the winter nights, with my hands freezing while measuring lumber to ensure Victoria Vance would have a secure roof over her head. Bradley had taken that security and twisted it into a weapon of theft. Tap! I remembered teaching my daughter the value of hard work. I remembered telling her that honesty was the only currency that truly mattered in a marriage. She had married a thief. She had married a man who stole from her own father to buy her expensive gifts and masquerade as a titan of industry. Did she know? That was the question that burned through my mind with every strike of the metal pen. Did my daughter watch her husband swipe a platinum card with my name on it to pay for her extravagant life? The silence from the monitor offered no answers, but only a growing mountain of debt carrying my signature. Tap! Robert watched me in respectful silence. He understood that he was witnessing a man absorbing a fatal blow. The physical assault at the guest house had been an act of momentary rage. This was entirely different. This was a cold and premeditated and long-term parasitic infection. Bradley had sat at my dinner table and smiled at my face while secretly draining my financial identity night after night. He had looked at me with disdain while wearing clothes my credit had purchased. He had called me a freeloader while literally existing on stolen funds. Tap! I stopped moving the pen. I laid it gently back onto the glass surface. The rhythmic sound ceased and left a heavy and dangerous quiet in its wake. The initial shock had passed and was replaced by a cold and calculating fury. The emotional pain of betrayal was rapidly crystallizing into a profound tactical clarity. I looked at the cascading numbers on the screen. The debt was substantial. It was a massive financial liability that had been secretly attached to my name. But as I stared at the screen, I realized Bradley had made a catastrophic amateur mistake. In his arrogance and in his desperate need to project immense wealth, he had left a perfect and undeniable paper trail of federal fraud. He had forged my signature. He had committed identity theft on a massive and undeniable scale. He thought he had outsmarted a foolish old man. He thought he had found an endless well of invisible money. He did not realize he had meticulously documented his own criminal destruction. I looked across the table at my lawyer. I did not ask him what our options were. I did not ask him for advice on how to confront my family. I pointed to the screen and issued a direct and undeniable command. I instructed Robert to compile every single fraudulent transaction. I told him to gather every forged signature and every digital footprint of Bradley's theft. We were not going to negotiate a repayment plan. We were not going to handle this quietly within the family. I was going to take the entire mountain of evidence and hand it directly to the authorities. Bradley wanted to play the role of a powerful and untouchable king. I was going to ensure he played that role in a federal courtroom. The parasite had left a trail of blood, and I was going to use that exact trail to lead the hunters directly to his door. The hum of the city traffic far below Robert Hayes's window felt like a distant memory. Inside the 42nd floor office, the atmosphere had grown infinitely heavier. The revelation of the stolen credit cards was a sickening blow, but it was merely the opening act of a much darker play. The absolute clinical nature of the transaction fueled a cold, calculating determination inside my chest. I realized that if Bradley was involved in this, it might constitute elder financial abuse under California Welfare and Institutions Code, Parks v. 15-6-1030. If he had falsified any documents to force the sale, it would be a clear violation of California Penal Code, Section 470 forgery, making the entire transaction void ab initio. I even considered invoking the prenuptial agreement infidelity clause, knowing how tightly Bradley guarded his financial secrets. Robert did not close his laptop. He did not offer a comforting word. His fingers returned to the keyboard with a renewed grim intensity. He bypassed the standard credit bureaus and accessed a different secured database. It was a portal connected directly to the county property records and municipal deed registries. The rapid clicking of his keys sounded like a countdown to an inevitable disaster. He found what he was looking for. A heavy silence descended over the room as a scanned legal document rendered on the large monitor. Robert slowly turned the screen toward me. He did not point. He simply let the document speak for itself. It was a commercial lien. It was a formal mortgage agreement secured against a specific 2-acre parcel of the lakefront estate. It was the parcel containing the old boathouse and the eastern stretch of the shoreline. The amount listed on the loan was staggering, $400,000. I stared at the bold black numbers printed on the digital page. I had never borrowed a single cent against that property. I had paid off the original construction loans 3 decades ago. My eyes drifted to the bottom of the document to the authorization line. My name was printed there in stark black ink, Richard Vance. And right above the printed letters was a signature. It was a signature attempting to mimic my own. I leaned closer to the glowing screen. The blood in my veins turned to ice. It was a magnificent and terrifying forgery, but it was still a forgery. The loop of the letter G was slightly too wide. The slant of the C lacked the sharp and rigid angle I had used my entire life. Someone had sat at a desk, studied my handwriting, and practiced stealing my identity stroke by careful stroke. That someone was the man currently drinking expensive bourbon on my patio. Robert broke the silence. His voice was clinical and devoid of emotion. He explained that this was not a traditional loan from a reputable banking institution. Bradley had not walked into a local branch to secure this money. The lender listed on the deed was a shadowy holding company with a notoriously aggressive reputation. They were private equity lenders operating on the fringes of the legal financial system. They were underworld financiers who provided immediate untraceable cash at extortionate interest rates. They did not send polite letters when a payment was missed. They sent aggressive enforcers. They seized assets through brute force and relentless, suffocating litigation. The monstrous reality of Bradley's desperation began to take shape. Robert pulled up another set of records charting the catastrophic collapse of Bradley's supposed business empire. The brilliant investments Victoria Vance constantly bragged about were a complete mirage. Bradley was drowning in a spectacular ocean of debt. His legitimate credit lines were exhausted. His business partners were demanding returns he could not provide. The lavish lifestyle, the designer clothes, the catered barbecues, they were all the frantic and flailing actions of a man trying to hide his total financial ruin. When the traditional world cut him off, he had turned to the shadows. He had gone to dangerous men for a dangerous loan. But dangerous men require solid collateral. Bradley had no assets to his name. He owned nothing of actual value. So he offered them my sanctuary. He offered them the earth I had moved with my own 2 hands. He offered them the legacy I had built to protect my family. He had placed a massive glowing target directly onto the roof of my home. If Bradley defaulted on this high-risk loan, the shadow lenders would not go after him. They would come directly to the lakefront estate. They would foreclose on the property legally bound to my name. Bradley had used my home as a sacrificial lamb to buy himself a few more months of pretending to be a king. The emotional processing of this crime shifted something fundamental inside my chest. This was not a crime of passion. This was not a heat-of-the-moment mistake made out of foolish pride. This was an act of cold and calculated malice. Bradley had to locate my private documents. He had to copy my signature repeatedly until he perfected the forgery. He had to secure the services of a corrupt or utterly incompetent notary public to authorize the fraudulent deed. He had done all of this in secret. Then he had returned to the estate, sat across from me at the dinner table, and looked me in the eye, knowing he had just signed away a piece of my safety to ruthless criminals. He despised me. He openly mocked my age and my presence on the property. Yet, he needed my blood to survive. He was a parasite, perfectly willing to kill the host just to extend his own miserable existence. I thought of Victoria Vance standing beside him in the guest house. I wondered with a sickening dread if she knew the depths of his depravity. Did she know her husband had committed a felony to pay for the silk blouse she was wearing? Even if she was ignorant of the mechanical details of the forgery, she happily inhabited the fragile, stolen bubble it funded. She had traded the absolute security her father provided for the glittering illusions of a criminal. The grief and the shock were entirely burned away now. What remained in their place was cold, hard-tempered steel. Bradley had crossed a line from which there was absolutely no return. He was no longer just an arrogant son-in-law disrespecting my boundaries. He had committed first-degree forgery. He had committed real estate fraud. He had committed grand larceny. The man who had threatened to evict me from my own property was standing on the precipice of a federal prison sentence. I was no longer an inconvenience to be managed. I was the key witness to his absolute destruction. I looked away from the monitor and met Robert's gaze. I did not ask him for a defensive strategy. I did not ask him how we could untangle this mess quietly to save the family face. I leaned back in the heavy leather chair and issued a direct, undeniable command: disk fraudulent transaction, every forged signature, and every digital footprint of Bradley's theft. We were not going to negotiate a repayment plan. We were not going to handle this behind closed doors. I told Robert to prepare the entire mountain of evidence for the district attorney. I told him to completely freeze the assets within the revocable living trust immediately. Bradley wanted to play a high-stakes game with dangerous people in the shadows. I was going to strip away the stolen armor of my name and force him to face those dangerous men entirely alone. He had built a beautiful, elaborate trap intended to discard me without realizing he had actually constructed the exact cage that would lock him away forever. The era of my silent suffering was officially over. The era of his consequences had just begun. The glowing screen of the monitor illuminated the dark, polished wood of the office. Robert reached for his heavy desk phone. His hand hovered over the receiver. He told me he possessed the direct contact information for the lead investigator at the Financial Crimes Division. He stated that we could have federal agents pulling up to the lakefront estate within the hour. Bradley could be forced to the ground and placed in handcuffs in front of his wealthy business associates before the afternoon sun began to set. I reached across the cold glass table and pressed my hand flat against the top of the phone. I pushed it back down into its cradle. I told my lawyer to leave the police out of this. Calling the authorities immediately was the conventional expected reaction. It was the loud, chaotic, and messy path. If Bradley were arrested on the patio, he would twist the narrative. He would play the victim of a sudden, terrible misunderstanding. He would spin a web of lies about an investment deal gone wrong. Worse, an immediate arrest would allow Victoria Vance to rally behind her husband. She would unite with him against the tyrannical father, who had supposedly ruined their lives out of spite. I did not want a loud spectacle. I wanted a total silent and absolute dismantling. I told Robert that when a tree is deeply rotted with disease, you do not waste your energy hacking wildly at the branches. You sink your blade straight into the earth and sever the taproot. I wanted Bradley and Victoria Vance to experience the exact weight of the world they claimed to own. I wanted them to feel the crushing gravity of reality before the law ever touched them. I instructed my lawyer to access the master portals for my banking network. We began with the stolen credit. I watched Robert navigate the complex security interfaces. He pulled up the registry of the 7 premium credit cards Bradley had fraudulently established under my social security number. I did not ask for the spending limits to be reduced. I did not ask for the accounts to be suspended temporarily pending a fraud investigation. I ordered Robert to permanently and irrevocably terminate every single piece of plastic tied to my name. I watched his finger depress the mouse button. I watched the green active status indicators blink out and turn to a stark permanent red. I pictured Bradley standing at the mahogany bar of his exclusive downtown club. I pictured him ordering rounds of imported scotch for his superficial colleagues. I imagined the exact moment he confidently handed that heavy metal card to a bartender. I imagined the machine flashing a harsh, undeniable decline. Bradley had loved parading me around as a conquered servant to feed his bottomless, fragile ego. Now he would experience the raw, suffocating panic of public humiliation when he realized his endless fountain of invisible wealth had suddenly run dry. The credit cards were only the beginning. I needed to cut the main artery. I moved on to the operating costs of the lakefront estate. For 3 agonizing years, I had quietly absorbed the immense financial burden of maintaining their royal illusion. I told Robert to access the automated payment registry connected to my primary checking account. I sat back in the leather chair and issued the execution orders one by one. I canceled the massive monthly payment for the high-voltage electricity grid that powered their imported chandeliers and their thumping outdoor sound system. I canceled the municipal water service that fed the hundreds of gallons needed for the custom infinity pool I had built. I terminated the recurring contracts for the premium landscaping crew, the weekly private security patrol, and the high-speed fiber optic internet network. I thought about the dark days immediately after Margaret passed away. I used to sit at the kitchen table late at night, carefully organizing these exact utility bills to ensure our home remained a warm, bright sanctuary. I had maintained that expensive light for Victoria Vance. I had kept the fires burning and the water running so she would never have to feel the cold, harsh reality of a world without her mother. She had taken that warmth, twisted it into entitlement, and used it to try and burn me alive. Now I was extinguishing the flame entirely. Within 48 hours, the magnificent estate they boasted about would be plunged into cold, silent darkness. Next, I turned my attention to the absolute core of their survival, the family trust dividend. When Victoria Vance married Bradley, I had quietly authorized a substantial recurring monthly transfer to be deposited directly into her private account. It was designed to be a silent safety net. It was meant to ensure my daughter never had to stay in a bad situation or endure a miserable job out of financial fear. She had taken that exact safety net and used it to fund a man who forged my signature to ruthless thieves. I invoked my absolute legal authority as the sole managing trustee of the estate. I ordered Robert to sever the transfer. I completely froze the dividend account. The financial pipeline connecting a lifetime of my hard work to my daughter's bank account was permanently welded shut. I felt a heavy, dull ache deep in my chest as the digital cancellation went through. A father is inherently wired to provide. A father is wired to protect, but true protection sometimes requires letting a child touch the hot stove they refuse to step away from. Victoria Vance believed she was an independent, powerful woman holding court over a vast empire. I was stripping away the illusion and leaving her with nothing but the bleak reality of her own arrogant choices. Robert finished the digital executions. He closed out the banking portals. The financial slaughter was complete. The safety net was gone. The credit was destroyed. The utilities were doomed. Bradley and Victoria Vance were now effectively bankrupt, sitting in a multi-million-dollar home they could no longer afford to light, heat, or maintain. But the financial ruin was only the first half of the equation. The physical removal was the second. I told Robert we needed to address their physical presence on the property immediately. I reminded him that they held no lease agreement. They paid absolutely no rent. They were not recognized as legal tenants under any municipal law. They were simply unauthorized occupants trespassing on property owned entirely by my trust. Robert opened a thick wooden drawer and pulled out a heavy sheet of legal parchment. He uncapped his fountain pen. He began to draft the document with swift, practiced strokes. It was not a standard 30-day eviction notice. The forged commercial mortgage document Bradley had created classified him as a direct criminal threat to the assets of the trust. Because of that specific documented felony, the law allowed for an immediate emergency removal procedure. Robert drafted a strict 72-hour notice to vacate. It was a brutal, uncompromising legal decree. It stated in plain language that Bradley and Victoria Vance Miller had exactly 3 days to pack their personal belongings and permanently vacate the premises. If they remained on the property 1 single second past the mandated deadline, they would be physically removed from the estate by armed county sheriffs for criminal trespassing. Robert finished writing the decree. He spun the heavy document around and pushed it across the glass table toward me. He offered me a silver pen. I looked down at the paper. I read the cold, clinical language demanding the removal of my own flesh and blood. I thought of the stiff, white catering apron crumpled in the trash can. I thought of the heavy bass vibrating through the walls of my guest house. I thought of Victoria Vance standing beside the man who called me a freeloader, looking down her nose and telling me that Margaret would be ashamed of my existence. I took the pen from Robert. I pressed the metal nib against the heavy paper. I did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. I signed my name on the bottom line. My signature was firm. My signature was sharp. The angles of the letters were harsh and precise. It looked absolutely nothing like the sloppy, desperate forgery Bradley had scrolled on his criminal loan document. I pushed the signed notice back to Robert. The dark ink gleamed wet under the harsh office lights. The trap was completely set. The financial oxygen had been violently sucked out of their atmosphere. The countdown timer on their physical shelter had officially begun ticking. They were currently sitting on the sunny patio drinking expensive wine, completely oblivious to the fact that their entire universe had just been vaporized. They thought they had won the war by driving a weak old man off the property. They did not understand that by forcing me out the door, they had simply given me the quiet space necessary to arm the detonator. 6 days passed in absolute uninterrupted silence. The world inside my modest hotel room in downtown Seattle was small, clean, and entirely under my control. I had chosen a room on a high floor, overlooking the gray waters of Puget Sound. The rhythmic hum of the city traffic below served as a soothing replacement for the constant chaotic noise of the estate I had left behind. For 6 days, I did not receive a single text message. I did not receive a single phone call. I existed in a quiet vacuum, breathing deeply, sleeping through the night for the first time in 3 years, and waiting for the inevitable laws of mathematics to catch up with my daughter and her husband. I knew the exact architecture of their impending ruin. I had built the financial calendar they lived by, so I knew precisely when their fabricated reality would collide with a concrete wall. The first of the month had arrived. I sat at a small round table by the window. The morning sky was overcast, casting a flat, even light across the room. A white porcelain cup of black coffee rested on the table in front of me. The digital clock on the bedside table clicked to 9 in the morning. A few seconds later, the dark screen of my cellular phone suddenly illuminated. The device began to vibrate against the wooden surface of the table. The sudden movement produced a low, urgent buzzing sound that shattered the peace of the room. I looked down at the screen. The name Victoria Vance appeared in bright white letters. I did not reach for the phone. I leaned back in my chair and watched the device dance across the wood. The screen went dark after a minute. 10 seconds later, it illuminated again. The name display was Bradley. He was calling from his private cellular number. I watched the screen glow vibrate and go dark again. This was not a casual morning greeting. This was not a daughter calling to check on the father she had banished from his own home. This was the frantic, breathless panic of a drowning crew, realizing there were no lifeboats on the ship. The phone lit up for a third time, then a fourth. Then a fifth. The calls began to overlap, arriving in a rapid, relentless succession. Victoria Vance, Bradley. Victoria Vance again. The device buzzed with a manic energy moving inches across the table, driven by the sheer volume of their desperation. 10 calls, 20 calls. I lifted my porcelain cup, Feeling the comforting heat radiating through the ceramic, I brought it to my lips and took a slow, deliberate sip. The coffee was dark, bitter, and grounding. I watched the counter on my screen register 30 missed calls, then 40. The digital display finally rested on the number 45. 45 missed calls within the span of 30 minutes. The financial bomb had officially detonated at the lakefront estate. I did not need to be standing in their lavish kitchen to know exactly what was happening miles away. I could picture the sequence of events with crystalline clarity. The morning would have started with Bradley attempting to project his usual aura of untouchable wealth. He likely stopped at his exclusive country club for his morning meeting, or perhaps he tried to pay the massive invoice from the disastrous barbecue. I pictured him handing over the heavy platinum card bearing my name. I pictured the momentary confusion on his face when the machine flashed a harsh, undeniable decline. I imagined him pulling out a second card and then a third, only to find every single piece of plastic completely paralyzed. The red indicators in Robert Hayes' office had done their job. Bradley's endless fountain of stolen prestige had run completely dry in public, while Bradley was experiencing the sudden suffocating horror of a declined transaction. Victoria Vance would have been facing her own catastrophic revelation. The first of the month was the day the family trust dividend automatically deposited into her private checking account. It was the silent safety net I had woven for her to ensure she never had to endure financial hardship. She relied on that massive influx of cash to pay for her imported clothes, her luxury vehicle lease, and the daily expenses of a lifestyle she had not earned. She would have opened her banking application on her phone, expecting to see a six-figure balance. Instead, she would have found a barren wasteland. The transfer had been permanently severed. The pipeline was welded shut. The immediate lack of funds was terrifying enough, but the true devastation would have arrived precisely at 8 in the morning via a certified courier. I knew Robert had dispatched the legal documents just as the sun came up. I envisioned the courier handing Victoria Vance a thick manila envelope. I pictured her tearing it open, expecting a simple piece of mail, and finding a formal 72-hour eviction notice staring back at her. The legal language would be cold and uncompromising. It would state that she and her husband were unauthorized occupants residing on property owned entirely by a revocable living trust. It would strip away the magnificent illusion that they were the masters of the estate. It would inform them that their electricity had been terminated. Their water supply was scheduled for shut-off, and their physical presence on the land was officially classified as criminal trespassing. The 45 missed calls were the sound of two arrogant people falling from a tremendous height and looking frantically for the soft mattress they had always taken for granted. Years ago, a single missed call from my daughter would have sent me rushing to my truck. I would have grabbed my keys, my heart pounding with pure paternal terror, terrified that she was stranded on a highway or hurt in an accident. I had spent my entire life rushing to fix her problems, smooth her paths, and shield her from the sharp edges of the world. My love had manifested as a relentless, invisible shield. I felt absolutely no urge to answer the phone now. I knew she was not physically injured. She was simply facing the consequences of her own profound cruelty. She was terrified because the man she had chosen, the man who had called her father a parasite, could not save her. Bradley could not protect her from the eviction notice because Bradley owned absolutely nothing. His entire existence was a forgery, and without my money to prop him up, he was nothing more than a frightened boy standing in a dark, cold house. The phone finally stopped buzzing. The screen went dark, leaving the hotel room in perfect silence once again. A small icon appeared at the top of the glass screen, indicating a new voice message. I set my coffee cup down on the table. I picked up the phone, unlocked the screen, and pressed the icon to listen to the message. The audio filled the quiet room. Victoria Vance's voice poured out of the small speaker. The icy, commanding tone she had used in the guest house was entirely gone. The arrogant woman who had invoked her dead mother to banish me had vanished. Her voice was high-pitched, breathless, and frantic. She did not ask how I was doing. She did not apologize for her behavior 6 days prior. She immediately demanded answers. She shrieked that her bank account was frozen. She cried that Bradley's credit cards were malfunctioning. She completely panicked over the legal document sitting on her kitchen island, claiming it had to be a catastrophic clerical error made by my lawyers. She demanded that I call the bank immediately and fix the glitch. She demanded I contact Robert and reprimand him for sending a threatening letter to her home. She still believed she was in control. She still believed this was simply a mistake that her obedient father would rush to correct. She had not yet comprehended that the demolition was intentional. I listened to her voice tremble. I listened to the background noise of the recording, catching the muffled sound of Bradley shouting profanities in the distance, likely arguing with a utility company or a furious creditor. The kingdom was burning to the ground around them. I waited until the recording finished. I did not save the message. I pressed the delete button, erasing her frantic demands from the device. I placed the phone face down on the wooden table. The psychological warfare had successfully transitioned from my quiet preparation to their loud, chaotic reality. The invisible tether connecting my bank accounts to their survival had been severed. They were in free fall, and the ground was approaching rapidly. I turned my chair to look out the window at the gray waters of the Sound, perfectly comfortable in the silence I had created, waiting for the 72 hours to expire. The afternoon light over Puget Sound began to fade into a dull and heavy gray. My phone vibrated against the wooden table. It was not another frantic call from my daughter. The caller identification displayed the secure line from Robert Hayes' office. I answered the call and listened to the steady voice of my attorney. Robert did not deal in gossip. He dealt in documented facts and verified financial events. He informed me that the digital traps we had set earlier that morning had not simply triggered. They had violently engaged. He had the exact chronological report of the first casualty. The event had not occurred at the lakefront estate. It had occurred in the pristine and sterile environment of an imported sports car showroom in the financial district. Robert relayed the sequence of events with clinical precision. Bradley had driven downtown shortly after lunch. He had walked into the dealership wearing his tailored linen suit and his expensive leather shoes. He had spent an hour inspecting a $200,000 luxury vehicle. He had spoken loudly to the sales staff. He had boasted about his recent investments and his expansive property portfolio. He had painted a magnificent portrait of a young titan of industry, rewarding himself for a successful quarter. He had demanded their premium attention, and they had provided it. They had brought him sparkling water in crystal glasses. They had ushered him into the private glass-walled office of the dealership manager to finalize the lease agreement. Bradley had sat in the leather chair opposite the manager. He had smiled his arrogant smile. He had casually reached into his designer wallet. He had pulled out the heavy black platinum card. It was the primary card tied to my stolen identity. It was the absolute foundation of his fraudulent empire. He had placed the card on the glass desk with the practiced ease of a man who believed his wealth was infinite. The manager took the card. He inserted the metal chip into the payment terminal. The terminal screen remained blank for a second. The network connected to the bank. The bank recognized the account number. The bank recognized the emergency fraud freeze I had authorized just hours before. The machine emitted a sharp, flat tone. The screen flashed a bright, undeniable red. The transaction was categorically declined. Robert described the report generated by the bank fraud department. The code returned to the merchant was not a simple notice of insufficient funds. It was a severe alert indicating stolen identity and frozen assets. The manager looked at the screen. He looked at Bradley. He politely informed his esteemed client that the card was not functioning. Bradley did not panic immediately. A man accustomed to living a lie relies on his ability to talk his way out of minor inconveniences. He laughed. He blamed the rigid security protocols of his bank. He told the manager that purchasing such an expensive vehicle must have triggered a routine fraud alert. He reached into his wallet again. He pulled out a second premium credit card. He handed it across the desk with a dismissive wave of his hand. The manager inserted the second card. The machine connected to the network. The network recognized the second frozen account. The machine emitted the same sharp, flat tone. The screen flashed red again, declined. The atmosphere inside the glass office shifted. The polite difference of the sales manager evaporated. He handed the second card back to Bradley. He informed him that the network was returning a critical fraud code. He stated that the bank had instructed the merchant to confiscate the card and contact the authorities. Bradley felt the first true wave of terror. The ground beneath his feet began to crumble. He demanded they run the card a third time. He insisted their machine was broken. He reached into his wallet and produced a third card. He produced a fourth. He threw them onto the glass desk like a desperate gambler throwing his last chips onto a losing table. The manager did not touch them. The manager calmly stood up from his chair. The glass walls of the office offered no privacy. The other salespeople on the showroom floor had stopped working. The wealthy clients inspecting the vehicles had turned their heads. The quiet, refined space of the dealership became an execution chamber for Bradley's ego. Everyone in the room watched a man who had walked in as a sovereign ruler suddenly unravel into a frantic, sweating fraud. Bradley lost his temper. He raised his voice. He shouted that he was a millionaire. He shouted that he owned a massive lakefront estate. He shouted that he could buy the entire dealership if he wanted to. Every word he screamed only highlighted his profound and pathetic impotence. The manager did not argue. He did not engage with the screaming. He simply picked up his desk phone and informed Bradley that if he did not leave the premises immediately, he would summon the police to resolve the severe fraud alerts attached to the stolen accounts. Bradley stopped shouting. The threat of law enforcement pierced his panic. He knew exactly what the police would find if they ran his name. He knew the cards did not belong to him. He knew the entire structure of his life was a criminal forgery. He snatched the useless plastic cards from the desk. He shoved them back into his wallet. He turned and walked out of the glass office. He did not look at the manager. He did not look at the salespeople. He kept his eyes fixed on the polished marble floor as he crossed the vast showroom. The silence that followed his departure was heavy and absolute. He had walked in as a conqueror. He walked out as a recognized criminal. The mask of the successful businessman had not simply slipped. It had been violently shattered into 1,000 irreparable pieces in front of the exact audience he desperately wanted to impress. Robert finished reading the report. The line went quiet. I listened to the faint static of the phone connection. I felt no joy. I felt no triumphant elation. I felt only the cold, sterile satisfaction of a mathematical equation balancing itself. Bradley had spent 3 years building an elaborate stage set. He had used my wood to build the floorboards. He had used my money to paint the scenery. He had used my blood to power the spotlights. He had stood center stage and demanded that the world bow to his greatness. I had simply reached backstage and pulled the master plug. I had plunged his theater into total darkness. I imagined Bradley sitting in his vehicle outside the dealership. I imagined his hands shaking on the steering wheel. I imagined him staring at the useless plastic cards in his wallet. He could not buy gasoline to drive home. He could not buy a cup of coffee to calm his nerves. The phantom wealth he had wrapped around himself like a shield had dissolved into smoke. He was entirely exposed. The humiliation in the showroom was only the opening skirmish. The 72-hour clock on the eviction notice was still ticking steadily away. The absolute structural demolition of his reality was proceeding exactly as I had designed. I thanked Robert for the update. I ended the call and placed the phone back onto the table. The silence returned to the hotel room, but it no longer felt empty. It felt like the quiet, methodical march of absolute justice. The afternoon sun was beginning to dip behind the tall pines framing the lakefront estate. Victoria Vance stood in the center of the massive gourmet kitchen. The silence of the house was no longer a symbol of tranquility. It was a suffocating vacuum. She stared at her cellular phone resting on the white marble island. The screen displayed 45 outgoing calls to her father. 45 frantic attempts to demand an explanation for her suddenly frozen bank accounts. 45 instances of absolute, unbroken silence. She paced across the imported Italian tile. She clutched a crystal glass of sparkling water. She tried to convince herself that this was a massive clerical error. Bradley was downtown fixing it. Her father was simply throwing a childish tantrum. Everything would be restored by dinner. The heavy crunch of thick tires on the pristine gravel driveway shattered her forced illusion. Victoria Vance turned toward the massive floor, toe-ceiling windows facing the front gates. She expected to see Bradley returning in his luxury sedan to announce that the banking glitch was resolved. She did not see her husband. She saw the stark, aggressive outline of two county sheriff patrol cruisers. They came to a halt directly in front of the grand oak doors. The rotating red and blue lights cast harsh, rhythmic flashes against the pale stone facade of the house. The colored lights reflected off the dark surface of the custom infinity pool her father had built. A man emerged from the lead vehicle. He wore the dark green uniform of the county sheriff. He walked with heavy, measured steps. He did not look around admiring the manicured lawn or the expensive architecture. He walked directly to the front entrance. The sound of his fist against the heavy oak wood echoed through the vast foyer. It was not a polite knock. It was the undeniable sound of authority demanding access. Victoria Vance felt a sudden violent wave of nausea. She set the crystal glass down on the counter. Her hands were shaking so violently she nearly knocked the glass over. She walked toward the front door. Every step felt like wading through deep water. She pulled the heavy iron handle. The door swung open to reveal the sheriff standing on the top step. His face was carved from stone. He asked to confirm her identity. She whispered her name. He asked if Bradley Miller was currently on the premises. Victoria Vance swallowed hard against the dryness in her throat. She told the officer her husband was downtown conducting business. The sheriff nodded slowly. He did not look surprised. He reached into the thick leather folder tucked under his arm. He retrieved two thick sealed manila envelopes. He held them out to her. Victoria Vance took the envelopes. The paper felt unnaturally heavy in her hands. The sheriff informed her that she had been officially served. He explained that the first envelope contained an emergency 72-hour order to vacate the premises. He stated clearly that she and her husband were entirely unauthorized occupants on property owned by a private trust. He warned her that if they were found on the estate after the expiration of the 72 hours, they would be physically removed and arrested for criminal trespassing. Victoria Vance stared at the officer in blank terror. She opened her mouth to argue. She wanted to scream that this was her house. She wanted to demand respect. The words died in her throat. The sheer weight of the legal authorities standing in front of her completely crushed her arrogant defiance. The sheriff did not stop speaking. He pointed to the second envelope. He advised her to secure immediate legal representation. He explained that the second packet contained a formal subpoena for a criminal investigation. He stated the charges plainly: grand larceny, wire fraud, first-degree forgery. He explained that local law enforcement, working in conjunction with financial crime investigators, had uncovered a fraudulent commercial mortgage secured against the estate. He told her that her husband had forged the signature of Richard Vance to secure a massive illicit loan from unauthorized private lenders operating in the criminal underworld. He informed her that all associated accounts were frozen and the assets were currently under federal scrutiny. The world tilted violently on its axis. The tall pines spun against the gray sky. The oxygen was sucked entirely out of the grand foyer. Victoria Vance gripped the doorframe to keep her knees from buckling. The sheriff tipped his hat politely. He turned around and walked back to his patrol cruiser. The heavy doors of the vehicle slammed shut. The tires crunched against the gravel as the police cars drove away, leaving Victoria Vance standing completely alone on the threshold of her ruined kingdom. She stumbled backward into the house. The massive oak door clicked shut. The grand foyer suddenly felt like a beautifully decorated prison. She dropped the envelopes onto a polished console table. The reality of the sheriff's words detonated in her mind. Bradley had not just lied about his wealth. He had not just exaggerated his success. He was a criminal. He was a desperate fraud who had stolen the very ground beneath her feet to buy the designer clothes in her closet. He had forged her own father's signature to borrow money from dangerous men. The lavish parties, the expensive dinners, the country club memberships, they were all purchased with stolen money. She was wearing a thief's jewelry. She was standing in a house she had no legal right to occupy. Victoria Vance snatched her phone from her pocket. She frantically dialed Bradley's number. She needed him to tell her this was a horrible mistake. She needed the arrogant, confident man she married to fix the collapsing walls of their reality. She pressed the phone to her ear. The line rang once. The line rang twice. The ringing stopped abruptly. A sterile automated voice informed her that the subscriber was currently unavailable. The call had gone straight to voicemail. She dialed again. Her fingers slipped against the smooth glass of the screen. The result was identical. The line was dead. The truth settled into her bones with a freezing clarity. Bradley was not in a boardroom negotiating a deal. Bradley was not at the bank fixing a glitch. Bradley was running. He had undoubtedly tried to use his stolen credit cards. He had felt the trap snap shut around his ankles. He knew the police were coming for him. The man who had strutted across the patio hours ago, mocking a grieving old man, had transformed into a cowardly fugitive. He had abandoned her in the massive empty house to face the police and the eviction entirely alone. He had used her father's estate as a sacrificial lamb for his own financial ruin and then vanished into the shadows. Victoria Vance slowly lowered the phone. The screen illuminated the dimming foyer. She backed away from the console table. She slid down the cool surface of the wall until she hit the marble floor. She pulled her knees to her chest. She looked down at the glowing screen of her phone. The display still showed the call log. Beneath Bradley's unanswered calls was the long list of her 45 missed calls to Richard Vance. She stared at her father's name. She finally understood the magnitude of her fatal error. She had pushed a quiet, generous man past the point of endurance. She had mistaken his silent patience for weakness. She had thrown him out into the cold, expecting to claim his entire world as her own. Now she was sitting on the floor of a house that did not belong to her, holding a phone that could not connect her to anyone who cared. She begged the silent phone for a response. She prayed for her father to call her back, to yell at her, to scold her, to do anything that proved he still considered her his daughter. The phone remained completely dark. The silence of the house was absolute. The 45 missed calls were not waiting for an answer. The profound, deafening silence of the man she had banished was the only answer she would ever receive. The gray light of the Seattle afternoon filtered through the hotel window. I sat alone at the small wooden table. I opened my laptop and entered a complex sequence of passwords. I had installed the discrete high-definition security cameras throughout the main corridors of the lakefront estate 3 years ago. I had installed them to monitor the perimeter and ensure the physical safety of my property. Today, those silent lenses served an entirely different purpose. Today, they were the front row seats to a magnificent and inevitable implosion. The digital feed buffered for a second before rendering a crystal clearer image of the grand foyer. Victoria Vance was still sitting on the cold marble floor. She was surrounded by the heavy legal documents the county sheriff had delivered. Her knees were pulled tightly to her chest. She looked small and entirely broken. The massive crystal chandelier above her cast long shadows across the imported tile. The silence of the digital feed was suddenly broken by the aggressive sound of screeching tires. A vehicle had entered the driveway at a reckless speed. The heavy crunch of gravel echoed through the exterior microphones. A car door slammed with a violent metallic thud. Heavy footsteps sprinted up the front stairs. The large oak doors burst open. Bradley stumbled into the foyer. He looked nothing like the arrogant sovereign who had mocked me on the patio 6 days prior. The pristine illusion of the wealthy businessman had completely evaporated. His expensive linen jacket was slung carelessly over his shoulder. His designer shirt was wrinkled and stained with sweat beneath the arms. His face was flushed red and his chest heaved with frantic, uneven breaths. He looked exactly like a cornered animal. Realizing the hunters had finally blocked every single exit, he saw Victoria Vance sitting on the floor. He stopped abruptly. He took a deep breath and attempted to compose himself. He attempted to pull the shattered pieces of his mask back over his face. He smoothed his hair and forced a weak, trembling smile. He told her to pack her bags immediately. He told her there had been a massive and ridiculous banking error. He claimed they needed to leave the estate for the weekend, while his legal team sorted out a massive misunderstanding with the financial institutions. He lied with the smooth, practiced rhythm of a man who had built his entire existence on deception. Victoria Vance did not move to pack her bags. She did not offer him a sympathetic smile. She slowly pushed herself up from the marble floor. She held the thick manila envelopes in her hands. She extended the documents toward him. She told him the county sheriff had already been to the house. She told him their bank accounts were not suffering from a clerical error. She read the bold black words printed on the federal subpoena out loud. She read the words commercial lien. She read the words private equity lenders. She read the words first-degree forgery and grand larceny. Bradley froze. The color drained entirely from his face, leaving behind a sickly pale gray. The security camera captured the exact moment his fabricated universe collapsed into dust. He lunged forward and snatched the papers from her trembling hands. His eyes darted across the legal text. He tried to construct another lie. He stammered that her father was crazy. He claimed I was orchestrating a massive and illegal conspiracy to frame him out of pure spite. He tried to deflect the blame back onto the man he had secretly bled dry. Victoria Vance stepped back from him. She was an arrogant and spoiled woman, but she was not entirely foolish. The fragmented pieces of the past 3 years suddenly aligned in her mind with brutal clarity. She remembered the endless stream of declined credit cards. She remembered the mysterious and sudden influxes of cash he could never clearly explain. She remembered the aggressive phone calls he took in the middle of the night. She looked at the man she had promised to love and realized she had married a phantom. She realized he had used her fatherland as collateral to keep their sinking ship afloat for a few more pathetic months. The dynamic in the grand foyer violently shifted. The united front they had so proudly presented to push me out of my own home shattered. They did not ally against me. The rats were trapped in a burning cage, and they immediately turned their sharp teeth on each other. Victoria Vance screamed at him. She called him a miserable fraud. She called him a pathetic thief. She demanded to know exactly how much money he had stolen from her family. She demanded to know how he could be so incredibly stupid as to forge a signature on federal documents. Her voice echoed off the high ceilings, filled with a toxic mixture of panic and deep visceral disgust. Bradley did not cower. His fear instantly metastasized into a vicious and cornered rage. He dropped the loving husband routine entirely. The sweet, supportive mask was torn away to reveal the calculating parasite underneath. He stepped into her personal space and pointed a trembling finger directly at her face. He did not apologize. He attacked. He listed her endless and staggering expenses. He listed the designer handbags she purchased every month. He listed the imported Italian tiles she demanded for the pool deck. He listed the lavish catered parties she insisted on hosting to impress her shallow friends. He told her he had forged those documents and stolen that money, simply to feed her relentless and bottomless greed. He told her she was equally guilty of the crimes written on those papers. He told her she had happily turned a blind eye to the origin of the money, as long as she could comfortably play the role of the wealthy A's. He stripped away her victimhood with ruthless precision. He forced her to look at her own profound complicity in their destruction. He told her she was a parasite who had happily consumed the blood he had stolen. The psychological breaking point arrived. Victoria Vance realized the supreme arrogance she had poured over me was entirely unearned. Her superior status, her entire identity was built on a foundation of absolute rot. Her husband had not elevated her to greatness. He had firmly tethered her to a sinking ship of federal felonies. She was not a queen. She was the unknowing accomplice to a desperate criminal. Victoria Vance swung her right arm with all the force she possessed. Her open palm connected with the side of Bradley's face. The physical impact produced a sharp, violent crack. The sound was deafening. The audio feed on my laptop transmitted the harsh echo as it bounced off the polished marble walls of the foyer. It was a brutal, uncompromising strike. That singular sound resonated deeply within my chest. The sound of that slap was the exact physical manifestation of the cruelty she had inflicted upon me for years. It was the echo of her ungrateful demands. It was the echo of her dismissive sneers. It was the loud, undeniable sound of a toxic illusion shattering into irreversible reality. The snake had finally reached around and swallowed its own tail. Bradley stumbled backward, holding his reamed cheek. He looked at his wife. His eyes were dark and hollow and entirely devoid of love. The alliance was permanently dead. They were two drowning people fighting over a single piece of driftwood. He did not say another word. He turned his back on her and walked toward the kitchen, leaving her standing alone in the grand foyer, weeping uncontrollably into her hands. I sat in the quiet hotel room. I watched the digital feed of the empty hallway. The execution was flawless. The structural demolition of their false empire was complete. They had absolutely nothing left but the bitter company of their own reflections. I closed the laptop screen and allowed the silence of the room to wash over me. The conference room inside Robert Hayes' downtown law firm was specifically designed to enforce a sense of absolute authority. The walls were paneled in dark polished mahogany, and the heavy scent of lemon oil hung in the air. I sat at the far end of a massive glass table. My hands rested flat against the cool, smooth surface. I felt a profound and complete stillness in my chest. The frantic heartbeat of a father desperately trying to save his family was entirely gone. It had been replaced by the steady and relentless rhythm of a man administering necessary justice. Robert sat to my right. He was arranging a series of pristine manila folders with surgical precision. We were waiting for the final act of this tragedy to begin. The heavy wooden door swung open. The receptionist did not announce them. Bradley and Victoria Vance simply walked into the room. The visual contrast between the two of them was startling. My daughter looked as though she had not slept in days. Her eyes were swollen and her posture was completely defeated. She walked to the farthest chair and sat down without looking at me. She kept her gaze fixed firmly on her hands. Bradley took a completely different approach. He strode into the room with his chest puffed out. He wore a sharp navy suit and a defiant scowl. He was a cornered animal choosing to bare his teeth instead of surrender. He pulled out the chair directly across from me and sat down heavily. He crossed his arms over his chest and glared. He did not wait for Robert to formally open the meeting. He immediately launched into a rehearsed and vicious tirade. His voice filled the room with an aggressive volume. He demanded to know what kind of sick game I was playing. He pointed a finger across the table and declared that my actions were entirely illegal. He threatened me with massive civil lawsuits. He claimed he had spent the entire morning speaking with top-tier litigators who were eager to destroy my trust fund. He stated loudly that freezing their accounts and issuing a fraudulent eviction notice was a clear sign of severe mental decline. He told Robert that he was preparing to file an emergency injunction to have me placed under permanent legal guardianship. He spun a frantic narrative, portraying himself as the devoted son-in-law, trying to protect his wife from a deranged and abusive old man. I listened to his voice bounce off the soundproof walls. I remembered the very first time Victoria Vance brought him to the lakefront estate. He had brought a bottle of expensive wine and shook my hand with overwhelming respect. He had looked me in the eye and promised he would spend his entire life ensuring my daughter was safe and protected. I realized now that the respectful young man had never actually existed. It was merely a costume he wore to gain access to the vault. Now that the vault was locked, he was showing his true face. His threats grew louder and more desperate. He claimed he would drag my name through the mud. He said he would take everything I owned in punitive damages. I did not interrupt him. I did not defend myself against his ridiculous accusations. I simply let him speak. I let him empty his lungs. I let him build his imaginary fortress of legal threats higher and higher. The more he shouted, the more pathetic he looked. A man who truly holds power does not need to scream to make his presence known. Victoria Vance flinched with every word her husband shouted, but she remained completely silent. She knew the truth of what had happened in their foyer the day before. She knew the alliance was dead. Robert sat perfectly still, with his hands folded neatly in his lap. He watched Bradley with the detached fascination of a scientist observing a doomed insect. Bradley finally ran out of breath. He slammed his hand flat against the table, demanding a response. He demanded that I restore his credit immediately and withdraw the eviction notice before he ruined the rest of my miserable life. The room fell into an absolute suffocating silence. The air felt heavy and charged with electricity. I looked at Bradley. I looked deeply into his panic, sweating face. I slowly reached out and picked up the thickest manila folder resting in front of Robert. I did not open it. I held it in my right hand. I lifted it high above the center of the table. I brought it down against the thick glass with every ounce of physical strength I possessed. The sound of the heavy folder striking the glass was like a gunshot in the sterile room. It was a sharp, violent crack that instantly silenced all the oxygen in the space. Bradley jolted backward in his chair. Victoria Vance gasped and covered her mouth with her hands. I kept my hand pressed firmly on top of the folder. I leaned forward until my face was only inches from Bradley. I told him his performance was over. I told him he was not going to sue me. I told him he was not going to hire any litigators. I slid the folder across the smooth glass until it hit his chest. I told him to open the file. Bradley looked down at the brown paper. His arrogant defiance flickered and died. His hands trembled as he flipped the cover open. The first document resting on top was the commercial lien from the shadow equity firm. The massive loan amount was highlighted in bright yellow ink. Below the loan details was the high-resolution scan of the signature page. My name was forged there in shaky, desperate ink. Bradley stared at the document. The color drained entirely from his face. His skin turned a sickly pale gray. His mouth opened, but no sound emerged. The grand illusion of his power was instantly vaporized by a single piece of paper. The dry, sharp sound of the folder hitting the glass had not just broken his tirade. It had permanently shattered his entire fraudulent existence. He looked up at me with wide, terrified eyes. He finally understood that I was not a confused old man reacting to disrespect. I was a man who held the absolute, irrefutable proof of his federal crimes. I told him that the private equity lenders were fully aware that the deed was fraudulent. I informed him that the local authorities possessed the exact same file he was currently holding. I watched the last remaining shreds of his arrogance bleed out onto the floor. I told him he had 72 hours to vacate my property before the sheriff arrived to physically remove him and transport him directly to a holding cell. I did not raise my voice. I did not scream. I delivered the destruction of his life with a whisper. The heavy silence in the mahogany conference room stretched into a suffocating eternity. Bradley stared at the forged commercial lien, resting on the glass table. His chest rose and fell in rapid, shallow jerks. The arrogant litigator he had pretended to be just moments ago was gone entirely. Robert Hayes did not allow the silence to linger out of mercy. He allowed it to linger so the absolute reality of the situation could fully penetrate Bradley's panicked mind. When Robert finally spoke, his voice was clinical, devoid of any emotion, and sharp as a scalpel. He informed Bradley that the county sheriff who had delivered the eviction notice was merely a local courtesy. The true threat was not local. Robert stated that the Economic Crimes Division had officially taken jurisdiction over the fraudulent mortgage. He detailed how federal investigators had already seized the servers of the shadow equity firm. They possessed the original physical documents bearing the forged signatures. They had the digital footprints, tracking the stolen funds directly into accounts, solely controlled by Bradley. Robert adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and stated that the federal prosecutor was not simply looking for restitution. The prosecutor was actively seeking a grand jury indictment for multiple felony counts carrying a mandatory minimum sentence in a federal penitentiary. The word penitentiary hung in the air like a physical weight. Bradley physically recoiled from the table. He pressed his back hard against his leather chair. The crisp navy suit he had worn as armor now looked like a trap. The sweat that had been gathering on his forehead began to drip down the sides of his face. His eyes darted wildly around the room. He looked at the heavy wooden door. He looked at the floor-to-ceiling windows. He looked everywhere except at the forged document bearing his name. He was a man watching the walls of a concrete cell closing in around him. He realized that neither I nor Robert possessed the power to simply make this disappear. He had triggered a federal mechanism that could not be bribed, intimidated, or manipulated. The law was a relentless machine, and his arm was caught in the gears. Survival instinct is a ruthless force. It strips away every pretense of loyalty and love. Bradley realized he could not fight the evidence. He realized he could not intimidate the men sitting across from him. Therefore, he chose the only remaining tactic available to a coward. He searched frantically for a human shield. Bradley slowly turned his head and looked at Victoria Vance. My daughter was sitting frozen in her chair at the far end of the table. She was staring at her husband with an expression of blank horror. She had slapped him the day before, but a small, naive fraction of her mind had still hoped he possessed a hidden plan to save them. She had expected him to walk into this law firm and negotiate a settlement. Instead, she was watching him decompose into a terrified, cornered rat. Bradley pointed a trembling finger directly at his wife. His voice, previously loud and demanding, cracked into a high-pitched, frantic whine. He told Robert to look at her. He pushed himself forward and slapped his hand on the glass table. He shouted that he had never wanted to borrow that money. He claimed he had been perfectly content living within their means. He began to weave a frantic, pathetic narrative where he was the innocent victim of a manipulative and greedy woman. He stated that Victoria Vance had forced his hand. He shouted that she had demanded the imported cars, the designer wardrobes, and the endless catered parties to impress her wealthy friends. He told the room that she had threatened to leave him if he could not provide the lavish lifestyle she believed she was inherently owed. He leaned across the table and looked directly at me. He tried to build a sudden, twisted alliance between two men victimized by the same woman. He told me that my daughter was a parasite. He told me that she knew exactly where the money was coming from, but she had purposely looked the other way so she could continue playing the role of the beautiful A's. He claimed that every forged signature and every stolen dollar was executed under her strict and relentless emotional coercion. He offered his own wife to the federal investigators as the mastermind of the entire criminal enterprise, hoping they would be satisfied with her blood instead of his. I did not move. I did not blink. I simply watched the spectacular implosion of their toxic marriage. Victoria Vance did not scream. She did not throw a tantrum. She did not leap across the table to strike him again. The sheer magnitude of his cowardice paralyzed her completely. She looked at the man she had worshipped. She looked at the man she had chosen over her own father. She had thrown me out of my home to protect his pride. She had invoked her dead mother to justify his presence. And now, facing the slightest threat of personal consequence, he was happily throwing her onto the sacrificial altar. The profound disgust that washed over her face was absolute. It was a cold, quiet realization that shattered the very foundation of her identity. The enemy was not the strict father who had tried to teach her responsibility. The enemy was the smiling fraud sitting next to her. She looked at Bradley as if he were a rotting carcass. She did not say a single word to defend herself. His betrayal was so complete that words were entirely useless. Bradley saw the absolute contempt in her eyes. He looked back at me and saw only cold, unwavering justice. He looked at Robert and saw a man calculating the precise length of a prison sentence. The realization hit him with finality. There was no deal to be made. There was no lie left to tell. The human shield had failed. The legal net was drawn tight. Bradley stood up so violently that his heavy leather chair tipped backward and crashed against the mahogany-paneled wall. He did not bother to pick it up. He did not grab the forged documents. He took 2 steps backward, his chest heaving, his eyes wide with blind animal panic. He muttered a string of incoherent, breathless curses. He spun around on his heels. He threw open the heavy wooden door of the conference room and sprinted out into the reception area. We listened to the frantic sound of his leather shoes pounding against the hardwood floor of the corridor. We heard the distant ding of the elevator and the heavy metallic slide of the doors closing. Bradley had officially fled. He had chosen to become a fugitive rather than face the consequences of his actions. He had left behind his dignity, his marriage, and his stolen kingdom. The conference room returned to its former state of absolute silence. Robert calmly reached across the glass table. He collected the manila folder containing the forged lien. He tapped the edges of the paper against the glass to align them perfectly before placing them back into his pristine pile. Victoria Vance remained sitting in her chair. She was entirely alone. The massive fortune she believed she possessed was a lie. The husband she thought would protect her had vanished into the city to avoid federal agents. She had absolutely nothing left. I looked down the length of the glass table at my daughter. The lesson was brutal, but it was finally complete. She was sitting in the cold ashes of the fire she had happily helped to ignite. The rain began to fall against the thick glass of my hotel room window, just as the sun dipped below the Seattle skyline. The city lights flickered to life below, casting a cold and mechanical glow across the wet pavement. I stood by the window with a cup of black coffee in my hand, listening to the rhythmic drumming of the water against the pane. The storm outside mirrored the total devastation that had just occurred in Robert Hayes's mahogany conference room. Bradley had vanished into the shadows of the city as a wanted fugitive. The fraudulent empire had been entirely dismantled. Only one piece of the wreckage remained unaccounted for. I knew she would come. She had no money. She had no credit. She had no husband to hide behind. Her wealthy friends would immediately stop answering her calls the second they smelled the stench of federal indictments and bankruptcies. I was the only fixed point left in her rapidly disintegrating universe. The knock on my hotel room door was not the aggressive pounding of an entitled A's demanding service. It was a weak, hesitant sound. It was the sound of a person who had finally realized they were standing at the very edge of a terrifying abyss. Walked across the quiet room and opened the heavy wooden door. Victoria Vance stood in the dimly lit hotel corridor. The transformation was absolute and tragic. The arrogant woman who had worn her imported silk dresses like armor had completely vanished. Her clothes were damp from the rain. Her hair clung to her face in messy strands. Dark streaks of ruined makeup ran down her pale cheeks. She looked entirely broken, stripped of the illusions that had defined her entire adult existence. She looked up at me with wide, terrified eyes. She did not wait for an invitation. She immediately collapsed into a desperate weeping performance. She begged me to let her inside. She sobbed that she had nowhere else to go. She cried that Bradley was a monster who had tricked her, manipulated her, and destroyed her life without her knowledge. She cast herself as the ultimate victim of a cruel scheme, desperately trying to erase the memory of the day she had stood in my house and ordered me to leave. Her voice was high-pitched and frantic, bouncing off the walls of the quiet hallway. She reached out and tried to grab my hand. She deliberately lowered her voice, attempting to sound like the little girl I had raised. She called me Daddy. She reminded me of the time she had fallen off her bicycle when she was 7 years old. She reminded me of how I had carried her into the house, cleaned her scraped knee, and promised her that I would always be there to protect her from the pain of the world. She tried to weaponize the most sacred memories of my fatherhood, to force open the vault of my bank accounts. She wanted the man who used to fix her childhood mistakes to magically erase her adult felonies. She wanted me to buy her a new house, pay off the debts, and restore her to the throne she believed she deserved. I stood in the doorway and looked deeply into her tear-filled eyes. I did not feel the sudden, overwhelming urge to rescue her. I did not feel the blind protective instinct that had driven me for 45 years. Instead, a profound and sobering clarity washed over my mind. Listening to her weaponize my love made me realize my own massive failure. The easy rescues, the endless financial safety nets, the constant shielding from the harsh consequences of reality had not protected my daughter. They had poisoned her. My limitless generosity had acted as a toxic fertilizer, growing her entitlement and suffocating her gratitude. I had created a woman who believed that love meant writing a blank check. I had taught her that no matter how cruel she behaved, her father would always arrive to sweep up the broken glass. If I rescued her tonight, if I paid the debts and gave her a soft place to land, the cycle would simply reset. She would never change. She would only learn to be more careful with her cruelty. I pulled my hand away from her grasp. I did not do it with anger. I did it with the firm resolution of a man breaking a deadly addiction. I looked at her and spoke in a calm, quiet voice. I told her that the man who used to fix all her problems no longer existed. I told her that she had killed that man the day she banished him from his own home to impress a thief. I told her that she could not use the ghost of my love to escape the reality of her choices. I explained that she was a grown woman who had actively chosen arrogance over loyalty and greed over family. Victoria Vance stopped crying. The manipulative tears dried instantly on her cheeks. She stared at me in genuine shock. She had expected me to fold. She had banked her entire survival strategy on my inherent weakness for her tears. The realization that my emotional vault was permanently locked terrified her more than the federal subpoenas. She opened her mouth to argue to launch into another defensive tirade. I did not let her speak. I reached into the inner pocket of my jacket. I pulled out a plain white envelope. I held it out to her. She looked at the envelope. A desperate spark of hope flared in her eyes. She reached out and took it, assuming it contained a massive check or the keys to a new luxury apartment. I instructed her to open it. She tore the flap and pulled out the contents. There were no platinum credit cards. There were no deeds to waterfront properties. She held a cashier check and a single printed sheet of paper. I explained the contents with absolute clinical precision. I told her the printed paper contained the address of a local reputable employment agency that specialized in placing people in entry-level administrative jobs. I told her the cashier check was made out for exactly $500. I explained that the amount would cover a security deposit and exactly 1 month of rent at a modest working-class apartment complex on the outskirts of the city. She stared at the paper in her hands as if I had handed her a venomous snake. She looked up at me, clear throat, her face twisting in disgust and horror. She whispered that she could not live in a place like that. She stammered that she did not know how to work an entry-level job. She demanded to know how I could be so cruel as to leave her with practically nothing. I looked directly into her eyes and delivered the final absolute truth of the evening. I told her that I was giving her the only gift that had any real value. I was giving her reality. I explained that true wealth is not inherited or stolen. It is built through sweat, through failure, and through the slow, painful process of taking responsibility for your own life. I told her that she had spent her entire existence living on the unearned labor of others. Now she was going to learn exactly how much a single dollar truly costs when you have to earn it yourself. I told her that every mistake carries a price, and the bill for her arrogance had finally come due. I told her I loved her too much to ever let her be a parasite. Victoria Vance stood frozen in the hallway, clutching the envelope to her chest. She had no arguments left. The grand illusions had been burned away, leaving only the cold, hard ground beneath her feet. I did not wait for an apology. I did not wait for a thank you. I simply stepped back into the quiet sanctuary of my hotel room. I looked at my daughter one last time and slowly pushed the heavy wooden door forward. The latch engaged with a firm, solid click. The sound echoed with total finality, sealing the physical and emotional barrier between my peaceful reality and her necessary struggle. I turned away from the door and walked back to the window, listening to the rain, continuing to wash the city clean. 3 months evaporated into the crisp autumn air. I stood on the expansive glass balcony of my new penthouse apartment, high above the grid of downtown Seattle. The wind coming off Puget Sound was sharp and bracing. It carried the scent of salt and rain. Below me, the city moved in a continuous orderly rhythm of headlights and illuminated skyscrapers. I rested my hands on the cold metal railing and breathed deeply. The oxygen up here felt entirely different. It was thin and clean and entirely unpolluted by the suffocating weight of my previous existence. The lakefront estate was officially gone. The closing documents had been signed and countersigned 48 hours ago in Robert Hayes's immaculate mahogany conference. I had not sold the property to another wealthy family seeking a quiet suburban refuge. I had sold the entire massive parcel of land to an international luxury hotel corporation. They were already mobilizing heavy machinery to tear down the custom infinity pool and the imported Italian marble floors. The grand foyer where Bradley had strutted like a forged king and where Victoria Vance had wept like a broken child was scheduled for total demolition by the end of the month. They were going to raze the physical structure to the dirt and build a massive high-rise resort in its place. I felt absolutely no sentimental attachment to the impending destruction. The house had ceased to be a home the moment they decided my love was a weakness to be exploited. Converting the corrupted real estate into a massive infusion of liquid capital was the final step in sanitizing my portfolio. Every physical trace of their unearned arrogance was going to be ground into dust and paved over with concrete. The transition from a silent provider to an independent man had required a profound psychological recalibration. For 4 decades, my identity had been fundamentally tied to being a financial shield. I had measured my worth by my ability to absorb the hardships of those I loved. I had believed that endless generosity would eventually purchase genuine respect. I had been catastrophically wrong. I had confused love with submission. I had allowed my own daughter to treat me as a disposable resource because I was too terrified of losing her affection to establish basic human boundaries. Now, sitting in the quiet luxury of my penthouse, I recognized the absolute necessity of the pain I had endured and inflicted. The silence in my life was no longer the heavy, oppressive quiet of a man waiting for the next disaster. It was the solid, earned silence of a fortress with the gates securely locked. I had reclaimed my dignity by understanding a brutal reality. You cannot rescue people who view your salvation as their birthright. Giving money to a parasite does not cure the parasite, it simply kills the host. I turned away from this glass railing and walked back inside the warm apartment. The interior was decorated in dark, minimalist tones. There were no useless trinkets or expensive pieces of fragile art designed to impress shallow, close guests. Everything in the room had a distinct purpose. A cup of freshly brewed black coffee rested on the center of my polished granite dining table. Beside the ceramic cup, my cellular phone rested on a leather charging pad. The screen was dark. The room was perfectly still. Then the digital display suddenly illuminated the space with a harsh white light. The device vibrated against the leather, producing a low, urgent hum. I stepped toward the table and looked down at the screen. The name Victoria Vance was displayed in bold white letters. It had been exactly 90 days since I had handed her the cashier check and the address to a working-class apartment complex. 90 days for her to experience the crushing reality of waking up to an alarm clock, riding public transportation, and enduring the indignity of entry-level labor. 90 days for her to learn exactly how much a single dollar costs when you have to trade your own physical energy to acquire it. The call was entirely predictable. The timing was perfectly aligned with the expiration of her remaining funds. She had likely discovered that a modest administrative salary barely covered the basic necessities of survival. The cheap apartment was probably drafty. The commute was probably exhausting. Her wealthy friends had undoubtedly abandoned her the moment she could no longer afford to split the bill at high-end restaurants. The harsh concrete of the real world was finally scraping against her knees. I knew exactly what she was doing on the other end of the line. She was standing outside the glass doors of my secure building. She was crying real tears of exhaustion and panic. She was preparing a rehearsed apology designed to target my paternal instincts. She wanted to remind me of her childhood. She wanted to beg the old man to open the vault one more time. She wanted to trade a few words of temporary submission for a permanent escape from the consequences of her own terrible decisions. A year ago, the sight of her name on that screen would have triggered a massive surge of panic. I would have answered immediately, terrified that she was hurt or in physical danger. I would have instinctively reached for my wallet to soothe whatever crisis had upset her. I would have accepted her apologies without requiring any actual change in her behavior. Today, I felt absolutely nothing. My heart rate did not increase by a single beat. My breathing remained perfectly steady and deep. I reached out and picked up the phone. The vibration tingled against my palm. I did not swipe the green icon to accept the call. I tapped the small secondary menu on the glass screen. I navigated smoothly to the contact settings. I looked at the name of my only daughter one final time. I selected the option to permanently block the caller. I confirmed the selection with a single decisive press of my thumb. The screen immediately went completely dark. The vibration stopped instantly. The digital connection between my peaceful reality and her chaotic existence was severed forever. I set the silent phone face down on the cool granite table. The invisible tether that had drained my energy and my spirit for years was permanently dissolved. I lifted the warm ceramic cup and brought it to my lips. The black coffee was strong, bitter, and intensely grounding. I turned my head to look back out through the floor-to-ceiling windows at the sprawling Seattle skyline. The storm clouds were breaking apart over the dark water of the Sound, allowing a few sharp, brilliant rays of late-afternoon sun to pierce through the gray canopy. The natural laws of cause and effect had been strictly enforced. I had dismantled the grand illusions. I had exiled the parasites. I had reclaimed the absolute sovereignty of my own existence. Order had been meticulously restored to my universe. Absolute permanent peace belonged to me, and I would never allow another living soul to take it away. The lesson embedded within this tragedy is profound and clear. Unconditional love does not equate to unconditional financial rescue. When you constantly shield someone from the natural consequences of their own malicious or arrogant choices, you do not protect them. You actively prevent them from developing the resilience required to survive reality. True kindness often requires the immense courage to walk away and allow the people you care about to experience the full weight of their mistakes. Dignity cannot be gifted or inherited. It must be forged in the difficult fires of personal responsibility and earned independence. Please share your thoughts on this story and tell me which part resonated with you the most in the comments below.